My name is Captain Grace Graham. 23 years ago, my parents divorced. My father took my brother. My mother took my little sister. I, at 8 years old, was dumped at an orphanage. No one came back, no explanation. For 23 long years. At 18, the system threw me out onto the street with exactly $500. I joined the army, used iron discipline to survive, and built my own business from the ground up. The last Graham Bakery. Then they saw what I had built. And they started calling. Non-stop. After 2 decades of silence, first my father, then my mother, then my brother. 43 calls in a single week. So, I invited them to see it for themselves. I gave them the best seats at my grand opening. 80 people, 1 microphone, and a truth I'd kept locked away since I was 8 years old. What they saw shocked them. What I said, that shocked them even more. Before we begin, please like and subscribe. Let me know your location and local time in the comments. Now, let us go back to the summer of 2003. The air in that Georgia kitchen was thick enough to chew. Outside, the July sun was beating down on the red clay like a hammer on an anvil. Inside, it was worse. The humidity had turned the tiny house into a pressure cooker. I sat at the kitchen table, my 8-year-old legs dangling, feeling the cracked vinyl chair stick to the backs of my thighs. Gerald sat across from me. He smelled like motor oil, rusted mufflers, and stale cigarettes. He was leaning back, his jaw working on a piece of gray gum, eyes fixed on a torn copy of the local newspaper. He did not look at me. He never looked at me when he was thinking about money. His hands, stained black with engine grease that no soap could ever fully wash away, were resting near a stack of crumpled bills. My mother, Pamela, stood by the screen door. She was dressed in her Sunday best, even though it was a Tuesday. Her hair was pulled back so tight it made her eyes look permanently surprised. She clutched a worn blue suitcase, the Samsonite one she usually saved for church retreats. "It is done," Pamela said. Her voice was flat, like she was reading a grocery list. My brother Colton was already outside in the bed of Gerald's rusted Ford F-150. I could see the back of his head through the window. He was 12, and he looked relieved to be leaving. My little sister Jolene was tucked under Pamela's arm, clutching a one-eared teddy bear. She was 4. She did not understand the math of this room. I looked at the table. It was an old wooden thing, scarred by years of cheap dinners and spilled coffee. A jagged crack ran right down the middle, splitting the grain like a lightning strike. I traced the edge of that crack with my index finger, feeling the splintered wood bite into my skin. "What about me?" I asked. The words felt small. They did not even reach the ceiling. Silence followed. The only sound was the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the ceiling fan as it struggled to push the hot air around. Gerald did not move. He just kept chewing that gum. Pop. Pop. He reached up to rub the back of his neck, his greasy fingers leaving a smear on his collar. He looked at the wall, at the floor, at the door, anywhere but at the girl sitting 10 inches away. Pamela did not answer either. She just reached down and pulled the zipper on the blue suitcase. The sound was a sharp, metallic screech. Zip! It sounded like a final judgment. "Colton needs to learn the trade," Gerald muttered, finally speaking to the newspaper. "A boy needs his father. And Jolene? Well, she's just a baby. She stays with her mama." He went back to his paper. The math was finished. 2 parents, 3 children, 2 lifeboats. "But what about me?" I repeated. My voice was steadier this time. I was not crying. My eyes were dry, burning from the heat and the dust. Pamela stepped forward. She did not hug me. She did not even touch my shoulder. She just reached out and slid my glass of sweet tea toward me. The ice had long since melted, leaving a ring of condensation on the table. "The state has programs, Grace," she whispered. "Good people. People who have more than we do. People who can give you a real future." She made it sound like a gift. Like they were doing me a favor by erasing me from their lives. She used that church voice, the one she used when she was talking about charity, or the less fortunate. She was talking about me as if I were a bag of old clothes destined for a donation bin. Gerald finally looked up. He did not look into my eyes. He looked at my forehead. He reached out and patted the top of my head, the same way he would pat a stray dog before driving away. His palm was hot and felt like sandpaper. "We are doing what we have to do, kid," he said. "It is a tough world. You are a tough girl. You will be fine." I looked at them, really looked at them. For the first time in my 8 years, the veil dropped. They were not my protectors. They were not my world. They were just two people who had run out of space for a third child and decided I was the easiest piece to discard. I was the extra, the surplus, the part of the equation that did not balance. "We will find a way, honey," Pamela said, her hand on the screen door handle. "We will find a way to get you back. Just stay strong. We will come for you." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie the moment it left her mouth. It was a cheap, greasy lie meant to make her feel better, not me. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not throw the sweet tea at her Sunday dress. Instead, I pressed my finger harder into the crack in the table. I pushed until the sharp wood splinters sliced through my skin. I pushed until I felt the warm, metallic sting of blood welling up under my fingernail. I watched a single drop of red fall onto the white wood, soaking into the grain. I looked up at Gerald, then at Pamela. They were not my parents anymore. They were just targets. "Go," I said. The screen door creaked open, letting in a swarm of flies and the roar of the Georgia heat. Gerald stood up, grabbed his keys, and walked out without looking back. Pamela followed, the blue suitcase bumping against her leg. The Ford F-150 cranked to life, coughing a cloud of black smoke into the yard. I sat there, listening to the gravel crunch as they pulled away. I sat there until the house was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I looked down at the blood on the table. It was the only thing they had left me. I reached out and took a slow, deliberate sip of the lukewarm tea. It tasted like betrayal. Then I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the dust settle on the empty road. They thought they were leaving behind a victim. They were wrong. They were leaving behind a witness. The drive to St. Clair felt like a funeral procession where the corpse was still breathing. Gerald's Ford F-150 rattled over the Georgia backroads, the rusted floorboards vibrating under my sneakers like a dying heart. He did not say a word. He just gripped the greasy steering wheel with his black-stained fingers, his jaw set like he was hauling a load of scrap metal he could not wait to offload. I watched the red clay hills recede in the side mirror. I was 8 years old, wearing a thin cotton shirt that did not stand a chance against the cooling evening air. Behind us, the world I knew was shrinking into a cloud of dust. We pulled into the gravel lot of St. Clair's. It was a squat, gray building that looked more like a county jail than a home. The sign out front was peeling, the white paint curling like dead skin. Gerald killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of a man who had already checked out. He walked to the back of the truck, grabbed that blue Samsonite suitcase, and hauled it out. He did not carry it inside for me. He walked to the bottom of the concrete steps and dropped it. Clang. The metal locks hit the stone with a finality that made my stomach turn. I stood there, clutching the hem of my shirt, looking at him. I was waiting for the apology. I was waiting for him to tell me he would be back by Sunday. Instead, he reached out. He patted my head. His palm was rough, smelling of diesel and old sweat. It was not a fatherly touch. It was the way a man pats a stray dog on the head before he speeds off down the highway. "I'll be back," he said. He did not look me in the eye when he said it. He looked at the gray door of the facility. Then he turned, climbed back into the Ford, and cranked the ignition. I stood on that concrete slab and watched his red taillights tear through the darkness. They looked like two bleeding eyes receding into the pine trees. When the sound of the engine finally died, the night swallowed me whole. Inside, the air smelled like industrial floor bleach and unwashed laundry. A social worker with tired eyes led me to a room filled with 20 identical metal frames. Bed 42. That was my new name. I sat on the mattress. It was wrapped in thick, crinkling blue plastic. Every time I moved, the nylon squeaked, a sharp grating sound that echoed in the hollow room. There were no pillows, no blankets that smelled like home, just the biting scent of chemicals that stung my nostrils. I did not scream. I did not cry. My mother had taught me that tears were a waste of moisture. I laid back on that crinkling plastic and looked at the ceiling. There were water stains shaped like broken continents and hundreds of tiny gray spots in the acoustic tile. I started counting them. 1, 2, 3. I told myself I would only stay here until I reached 1,000. I told myself Gerald's truck would be back in the lot by morning, day 1. I sat by the window, day 3. I watched the gate until my eyes burned, day 7. I stopped looking at the parking lot. The spots on the ceiling were easier to track than the days. Time in the system does not move in straight lines. It circles like a vulture. I became a ghost in a building full of ghosts. We were just cargo waiting for a different port. 6 months passed before the phone rang for me. It was a Tuesday. I remember because the kitchen was serving mystery meatloaf that smelled like wet cardboard. The social worker pointed to the black wall unit in the hallway. I picked up the receiver. The cord was frayed, the copper wires peeking through the black rubber. "Grace, that you?" Gerald's voice was thin, obscured by a mountain of static. "Yes," I said. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. "You good?" "Yes." "Good, good." "Things are... Well, they are tight here, Grace. Colton's got a new job at the shop. Jolene's starting school." He did not ask if I liked the food. He did not ask if I was scared. He talked about them like I was a distant cousin he barely remembered. The silence on the line grew long. I waited for him to say the words. "I'm coming to get you." "Anyway," he muttered. "Take care of yourself, kid." Click. The dial tone was a long, flat line, a heartbeat that had finally stopped. I stood there holding that cold plastic receiver, listening to the buzz. The wall of hope I had been building since Georgia crumbled into dust right there in that hallway. Later, I found out the real reason for the silence. A girl from my hometown arrived 3 months later. She told me the gossip. Pamela had been busy. At the First Baptist Church, my mother had been performing a masterpiece. She told the ladies in the pews that I had been adopted by a nice, wealthy family in the city. She told them I was happy. She told them I was thriving. She did not tell them she had dumped me like a bag of trash at St. Clair. She killed my existence to save her own face. She erased me so she could keep her Sunday reputation clean. If you have ever been the one sacrificed so someone else could look good, hit that like button right now. It is the only way stories like this survive the silence. I want to hear from you. Comment the word survivor below if you have ever had to rebuild yourself from the wreckage others left behind. Don't forget to subscribe, because this was just the beginning of the darkness. I walked back to bed 42. I climbed onto the crinkling plastic and looked at the window. The moon was a cold, white eye staring down at the yard. I stood up and pulled the heavy gray curtain shut. I did not want to see the road anymore. I did not want to see the gate. I sat down in the center of the dark. I stopped waiting for the truck. I stopped waiting for the lie. I was officially a ghost. And ghosts do not need parents. They just need a way out. The light in bed 42 was always gray. It was the color of a life on hold, a dusty shade that matched the dingy curtains. But downstairs, at the end of the bleach-scented hallway, was a heavy steel door that bled orange light and smelled like burnt sugar. That was where Reuben Marshall lived. He was 64, with skin like cracked leather and a voice like gravel in a blender. He did not look at me with soggy, sympathetic eyes. He did not offer a hand to hold. "You want to eat?" Reuben asked. He did not wait for an answer. He slapped a 5-pound mound of cold dough onto the table. "Knead it until your arms go numb, then do it for another hour." I was 9 years old. My knuckles were white. I pushed. I pulled. Flour puffed up, coating my eyelashes and filling my lungs. It felt like trying to push a brick wall. After 30 minutes, the skin on my palms tore. Tiny dots of red speckled the white dough, blooming like angry flowers. I looked at Reuben, waiting for him to tell me to stop. He tapped his cigarette into a tin can. Flour does not care about your feelings, kid. It does not care that you are hungry or that your father is a coward. It only cares about the work. Do the work. That was my first real lesson in survival. Reuben had an old leather notebook. He kept it in the pocket of his stained apron. It was filled with measurements and temperatures, written in a cramped, precise hand. He threw it onto the table one night when I was 12. "Follow the recipe," he said. "The world is chaotic. People lie, weather turns. But 100 grams of sugar is always 100 grams of sugar. You master the formula, you master the outcome. Remember that, Grace." I mastered it. I spent years in that kitchen, sweating in front of industrial ovens that breathed heat like dragons. My hands grew thick. My back straightened. While the other kids were crying over foster parents who never called, I was counting the seconds on a kitchen timer. I was learning that discipline was the only thing no one could take from me. At 15, I learned about the paperwork. The office was always locked, but the hinges were old. A butter knife and leverage were all I needed. I found my file. It was thin, a school report, and the papers from 2003. I expected signatures. I expected a judge's order proving Gerald and Pamela could not afford a third mouth. I wanted to see a struggle. Instead, I found a memo. Parents declined to sign formal surrender of rights. It read, "Left child at facility without contact information. No legal barriers to adoption. Abandonment by choice." They had not even bothered to sign me away. That would have required effort. They just opened the door of the truck and let me tumble out like unwanted furniture. They were not even villains. They were just lazy. They threw me into the gears of the state because it was easier than filing a tax return. I sat on the cold floor and felt a new kind of cold settle in my chest. It was not sadness. It was a sharp clarity. I was not a person to them. I was an inconvenience solved with a 20-minute drive. I put the file back. I did not cry. I went back to the kitchen and baked 40 loaves of rye bread. I watched the crusts brown. I was building armor. Then came the day I turned 18. The system in America has a special way of saying goodbye. They call it aging out. It means the state is done paying for your bed. You are a legal adult with no history. The administrator handed me a check for $500. $500. That was the price tag on my childhood. 10 years of bed 42. 10 years of plastic mattresses. All of it boiled down to a piece of paper that would barely cover rent in a Georgia trailer park. "Good luck, Grace," the man said. He did not look up. I walked out of the front gate with my blue Samsonite suitcase. It was battered and dented, but it was mine. I walked 3 miles to the town center. I did not look for a job at a diner. I did not look for a room. I knew what happened to girls like me when they tried to play the game with $500. They ended up in the same red clay ditches their parents had dug for them. I stopped in front of a brick building with a flag out front. The glass door was heavy. I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of floor wax. A man in a camouflage uniform was sitting behind a desk. He looked at my posture. I stood straight. "I want to enlist," I said. He pulled out forms. "You have a high school diploma?" "GED," I said, "and I know how to follow a recipe." He did not ask what I meant. He slid the page toward me. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, like the rolling pin Reuben had given me when I was 9. I signed my name, Grace Graham. The recruiter took the paper and pressed a heavy rubber stamp onto the bottom. Thump. The sound echoed. It sounded like a door closing. "Welcome to the United States Army, recruit," he said. I looked at the stamp. Purple ink on white paper. It was the first time someone had actually wanted my signature. It was the first time I belonged to something with rules I could trust. I walked toward the bus station. I did not look back at the town. I did not look back at St. Clair. I had $500 and a contract to go to war. It was the best deal I'd ever signed, because for the first time, the recipe was mine. The desert heat in Iraq did not feel like the Georgia humidity. It was a dry, punishing weight that tasted of dust and burning diesel. I sat in a plywood shack at a forward operating base. the sound of rotors thumping in the distance. A lieutenant from the JAG office pushed a stack of papers across the scarred desk. It was the service members' group life insurance form, the death benefit. $400,000 if I did not make it back to the States. The lieutenant tapped a pen on the line for the primary beneficiary. Who is the next of kin, Captain? I looked at that line for a long time. I could see Gerald's greasy fingers. I could see Pamela's Sunday dress. I knew exactly what they would do with $400,000. Gerald would buy a new fleet of trucks and a case of cheap whiskey. Pamela would donate a new organ to the church to buy her way into a higher social circle, tell everyone it was a gift in memory of her beloved daughter. They would spend my blood money before my body was even cold. They would not even pay for a headstone. I wrote the name of an anonymous charity for foster children. I did not hesitate. My blood was just a liquid. My family was sitting outside in the sand, cleaning their rifles. We shared our water. We shared our letters from home. We shared the quiet fear that came before a night patrol. Those strangers knew the shape of my soul better than the people who shared my DNA. They taught me that family was not a birthright. It was a choice made in the dirt. 5 years later, I was back on Georgia soil. I did not go back to my hometown. I went to a town where no one knew Bed 42. I walked into a small office with my uniform pressed, my back as straight as a steel beam. I met Lorraine Collier. She was the town's iron lady, a woman who owned half the main street and did not suffer fools. She sat behind a desk made of heavy oak, looking at my discharge papers and my small business administration application. She did not look at my credit score first. She looked at the ribbons on my chest. She looked at the way I did not fidget. "You want to bake bread, Captain?" Lorraine asked. Her voice was like dry sandpaper. "I want to build a fortress that smells like yeast," I said. Lorraine leaned back. She did not ask for a cosigner. She did not ask for collateral. "I saw your squad's commendation. You do not quit. I will back the lease. You fail, and I will be the one who comes for your hide." "I do not fail," I replied. The last Graham was born in a gutted laundromat. We scrubbed every inch of that floor until the concrete shone. We installed stainless steel counters that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. I hired Dean, a kid who looked like I did at 18, hungry and looking for a reason to stand tall. I did not give him pep talks. I gave him a manual. "Everything is metric," I told him. My voice was clipped. "We do not guess. We do not feel the dough. We follow the recipe. If the scale says 500 grams, it is 500 grams, not 499. Clean as you go. If there is flour on the floor, you are losing discipline." Dean did not complain. He saw the way I worked. I was there at 4 in the morning, the military alarm ringing through the silence. I wore my combat boots because the soles were hard and kept me grounded. The kitchen was my platoon. The ovens were our engines. We moved in a synchronized dance of heat and flour. The smell of burnt French butter and sourdough began to define my life. It was a clean life, a life without shadows. A week before the grand opening, the shop was perfect. The glass cases were polished. The smell of rosemary and sea salt hung in the air. I was standing at the counter, a cup of black coffee in my hand. No sugar, no cream. I liked the bitterness. It kept me sharp. I was watching the steam rise when my phone began to vibrate on the stainless steel. It did not stop. I looked at the screen. It was an unknown number with a local area code. Then a text message flashed. "Grace, it is your mother. Pick up." I did not move. I watched the phone dance across the metal. Then another number. "Grace, this is Gerald. We need to talk. It is about Colton." 23 years of silence. 23 years of being a ghost. And then, in the span of 7 days, the floodgates opened. I did not answer a single one. I watched the counter on the lock screen climb. 10, 24, 38, 43 missed calls. They were like pings on a radar. An incoming strike. They did not want to know if I was happy. They did not want to know where I'd been. They had seen the news about the new veteran-owned business in the local paper. They had smelled the money. I picked up the phone. My hand did not shake. I scrolled through the names. Pamela, Gerald, Pamela, Gerald. It was a rhythmic assault. I thought about the blue Samsonite suitcase rotting in a landfill. I thought about the $500 check. I thought about the 43 times they had remembered I existed only when they needed a lifeboat. Dean walked in from the back, wiping his hands on a white towel. "Everything okay, boss? You look like you were back in the sandbox." I put the phone face down on the counter. The vibration hummed against the steel, a dull, nagging sound. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "Just some interference on the line, Dean," I said. I walked over to the front door and flipped the sign to "Closed." I locked the deadbolt. Through the glass, I could see a battered pickup truck idling at the edge of the parking lot. It was a Ford. It was rusted. The driver's side window was rolled down, and a plume of cigarette smoke drifted out into the humid Georgia evening. The first ghost had arrived at the gate. I did not hide. I stood right there in the window, my back straight, my eyes locked on the truck. I adjusted the collar of my work shirt. The man in the truck opened the door. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy, wet thud. He looked at the sign, then he looked at me. It was Gerald. He looked older, smaller, and even more desperate than the day he drove away from St. Clair. He raised a hand and began to pound on the glass. I did not open the door. I reached out and slowly turned the dial on the interior lights, plunging the front of the shop into total darkness. I let him stand in the shadows of my kingdom. The Wednesday afternoon sun was hitting the storefront glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the granite counters. I was polishing a tray of cooling sourdough loaves, the smell of roasted coffee and warm yeast filling the room. It was a clean smell, a successful smell. Then the bell above the door rang. It was not the light, melodic chime of a customer. It was a heavy, frantic rattle that signaled a breach in the perimeter. Gerald stepped inside. He looked like a smudge of grease on a white sheet. He was wearing an old work shirt, stained with motor oil and sour sweat that cut right through the aroma of my bakery. He did not look at me, not at first. His eyes darted toward the high ceilings, the custom light fixtures, and the rows of expensive ovens in the back. I watched his jaw work. He was not admiring the craftsmanship. He was running the numbers. He was counting the dollar signs attached to my life. I stopped polishing. I did not move toward him. I did not offer a greeting. I stood behind my counter, my back straight, my hands resting flat on the cold stone. I treated him like an unidentified target in a dark alley. "Grace," he muttered. He finally looked at my forehead. His skin was gray and sagging, the years of cheap beer and bad decisions catching up to him. He reached up to scratch his neck, his fingernails leaving red tracks in the grime. "Nice place you got here. Must have cost a fortune." "It cost 10 years of my life, Gerald," I said. My voice was a flat line. "What do you want?" He winced at the use of his name. He tried to summon a smile, but it came out as a desperate grimace. He stepped closer, his boots leaving mud on my freshly mopped floor. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it onto the granite with a trembling hand. It was a bank notice. Red ink, $40,000. "Colton is in trouble, kid," Gerald whispered. He leaned in, and the smell of stale cigarettes hit me. "He tried to open a parts shop, took out a loan against the house. He's a good boy, Grace. He had some bad luck. The bank is coming for the shop. They're going to take everything." I looked at the paper, then I looked at him. And Gerald's voice rose, a sharp, whiny edge cutting through the quiet. "You're his sister. Look at this place. You're drowning in money, Grace. You're a captain. You're the big success. Family sticks together. We're Grahams. You can't let your brother go under because of a few grand." I felt the ice settle in my gut. 23 years of silence. Not a single phone call when I was sitting in the dirt in a rock. Not a single letter when I was fighting the system for a place to sleep. But Colton, the golden boy who stayed, the one who didn't get dumped at St. Clair, had a debt. And suddenly, the Grahams were a team again. Family, I repeated. The word tasted like copper. You mean the family that didn't have a seat for me at the table in 2003? The family that couldn't afford an 8-year-old girl but can suddenly afford $40,000 for a failed parts shop? Gerald's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand onto the counter. The sound was hollow against the stone. That was a long time ago, Grace. We did our best. You don't know how hard it was. You did not do your best, I said. I leaned forward, my face inches from his. I did not blink. You did the easiest thing you could find. You threw a child away to save a buck. Now, you're here because I'm the only one left with a pulse and a bank account. I reached out and slid his lukewarm coffee toward him. I hadn't even realized I'd poured it. It was a habit, a hospitality I no longer felt. I am not your ATM, Gerald, and I am not Colton's safety net. The door is behind you. Use it. Gerald stared at me, his mouth hanging open. He looked for a moment like he was going to scream, to call me the names I knew he saved for me in private. Instead, he grabbed the bank notice, crumpled it into a ball, and spat on my floor. You're cold, Grace. You're just like that damn army. No heart, just stone. The army taught me how to spot a parasite, I replied. Now, get out of my shop. He turned and stumbled out, the screen door slamming behind him with a violent crack. I stood there for a long time, watching his rusted truck pull away. My hands were steady, but my chest felt like it was encased in iron. I walked over, grabbed a spray bottle of disinfectant, and wiped the spot where he had spat. I scrubbed until the granite shone again. I scrubbed until the smell of him was gone. The bell rang again an hour later. I didn't look up. We're closed, I barked. Since when do you close on a Wednesday at 4, Captain? It was Lorraine. She was carrying a heavy brown folder. She didn't look happy. She walked straight to the back office and tossed the folder onto my desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Your father wasn't the only one busy today, Lorraine said, her voice tight. I had a friend at the First Baptist over in your old county run some checks. Your mother, Pamela. She's been telling the congregation that you're the silent partner in her charity work. She's been using your military photos, the ones from the local paper, to solicit donations for a youth fund. I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the bank statements and the flyers. Pamela had stolen $1,100 from the church auxiliary fund, and she was using me, the hero daughter, as the shield to cover the hole in the books. They didn't want a daughter. They didn't even want my money yet. They wanted my reputation. They were using my uniform to bleach their sins. I looked at a photo of myself in combat gear, printed on a cheap church flyer. Above it, in bold letters, it read, "Support our troops, support our family." I felt the first crack in my discipline. It wasn't sadness. It was a white-hot, blinding no key. There's more, Lorraine whispered. She pointed to a printed text thread at the bottom of the pile. It was from Colton. To a number I didn't recognize. Don't worry about the debt, the message read. Grace is back. She's got the bakery. I've got the photos of what she did at the orphanage. She'll pay. Or she'll lose everything. I closed the folder. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the ovens. Lorraine, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Cancel the order for the morning rye. We aren't baking tomorrow. What are we doing, Grace? I reached into my drawer and pulled out my old leather notebook. I turned to a fresh page. We're going to war, I said. And this time, I'm bringing the evidence. The clock on the bakery wall was a circle of cold neon. 2 a.m. In the dark, the screen of my smartphone was a white knife, cutting into my retinas. I wasn't sleeping. Soldiers don't sleep when they know an ambush is set. I sat at my desk, the only sound the low hum of the refrigeration units and the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of my thumb against the glass. Colton had made his move. He didn't use a gun or a wrench. He used a thumb and a grudge. He had tagged the last gram in a post that was already spreading like a grease fire through the local community pages. It was an old photo. 1999. I was 7, wearing a faded sundress with a crooked hem, my hair in messy pigtails. I was smiling. I looked like a child who believed the world was a safe place. The caption was a masterpiece of parasitic fiction. Some people get a little bit of rank and a fancy shop and forget the people who raised them. My sister Grace likes to play the hero in a uniform, but she left her aging parents in the dirt. She hasn't called in 20 years. Now she's back in town, acting like a stranger while our mother cries herself to sleep. Is this the kind of veteran we want to support? Hashtag family first, hashtag the truth. I scrolled through the comments. They were coming in fast. Is this true? I was going to the opening tomorrow, but not if she's like that. Typical. Get a little success and look down on your roots. Sad. Colton knew exactly what he was doing. In a small Georgia town, reputation is the only currency that matters. He wasn't just attacking my business. He was attacking my character. He was trying to trigger a cancel culture mob before I could even open the doors. Then, the private message pinged. The post stays up, Grace. It goes to the local news next. I've got more photos. I've got stories. I'll make sure every person in this county thinks you're a monster. Unless you handle my problem. $25,000 for the gambling debt. By 8 a.m., or I burn your little empire to the ground. Your choice, Captain. I didn't reply. My fingers were steady, but my chest felt like it was being squeezed by a hydraulic press. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every inch of this floor. I grabbed a stainless steel baking sheet and a scrub brush. I began to scrub. Metal on metal. A harsh, rhythmic screech. I didn't stop until the steel was hot. I wasn't cleaning for hygiene. I was cleaning to keep my hands from becoming weapons. Colton thought he was a strategist. He thought he could use my past as a leash. He forgot one thing. I wasn't that girl in the pigtails anymore. I was a woman who had survived the desert and the system. I had been forged in a furnace he couldn't even imagine. At 4 a.m., the back door rattled. It wasn't a heavy, aggressive knock. It was a frantic, desperate scratching. I didn't reach for the handle. I reached for the heavy rolling pin on the counter, the one Reuben had given me. I stood to the side of the door, my back against the wall, my breathing shallow. Grace, it's me. Please, open the door. It was Jolene, my little sister, the one who stayed with Pamela. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open 6 inches. Jolene stood there in the humid night air, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She was wearing an oversized hoodie and clutching a yellowed, coffee-stained envelope to her chest. She looked like she was about to collapse. "They're going to kill me if they find out I'm here," she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't invite her in. I didn't offer a hug. "Why are you here, Jolene?" "Colton, he's crazy, Grace. He and Mama, they've been planning this since they saw your name in the paper. They don't want to be a family. They want the money. They think you owe them for surviving without you." She reached out and shoved the envelope into my hand. "I found this in the bottom of Mama's cedar chest. They were going to burn it tonight. I couldn't let them. Not after what they did to you." She didn't wait for a thank you. She turned and ran back toward the shadows of the parking lot, her footsteps disappearing into the sound of the crickets. I went back to my desk and turned on the small lamp. I pulled the contents out of the envelope. It was a single sheet of notebook paper dated August 14th, 2003. It was Pamela's handwriting. I recognized the loopy, fake sweet cursive immediately. It was a letter to Gerald, written the week after they dropped me at St. Clair. "Gerald, don't listen to what the social worker said. Don't go back for her. Leaving her there solves the problem for everyone. We can't afford the optics of a third child right now, and explaining her to the neighbors is just too much of an inconvenience. It's easier this way. Let the state handle it. She'll forget us eventually. We have to think about our future, not the past." Inconvenience. The word hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a victim of poverty. I wasn't a victim of a tough choice. I was a victim of their convenience. They had erased me because explaining my existence was too much work. I looked at the clock. 6 a.m. The sun was starting to bleed over the horizon, turning the Georgia sky a bruised shade of purple. If you have ever been treated like an inconvenience by the people who were supposed to love you, I need you to hit that like button right now. Let's show the parasites that we aren't invisible anymore. I want you to comment the word justice below if you're ready to see the truth come out. Subscribe and turn on those notifications because the grand opening is 2 hours away. And I'm about to show this town what a gram is really made of. I stood up. I walked to the locker in the back and pulled out my Class A uniform. I hadn't planned on wearing it. I wanted to be a baker today, not a soldier. But Colton had changed the rules of engagement. He wanted a war. He was going to get one. I ironed the shirt until the creases were sharp enough to draw blood. I polished my brass until it shone like gold. Then I took that letter, the 2003 proof of their betrayal, and I folded it neatly. I tucked it into the breast pocket of my uniform, right behind my ribbons. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. 8 a.m. 80 people were waiting outside. My family was among them, wearing their best proud relatives' masks. I reached for the door handle. It was time to open the shop, and it was time to close the book on the grams. The smell of fresh paint in the bakery was crisp, biting, and expensive. It was the scent of a new beginning, one I had paid for in sweat and desert dust. At 8 a.m., the morning light was just beginning to cut through the humidity of the Georgia air, spilling across the polished granite counters. I stood there in my Class A uniform. The fabric was stiff, the creases on the sleeves sharp enough to slice skin. My ribbons were aligned to the millimeter. This wasn't a celebration for me. It was a deployment. The back door creaked open. Reuben Marshall stepped in, leaning heavily on his carved oak cane. He looked older than he did in the St. Clair kitchen, his skin more like worn saddle leather, his eyes clouded but sharp. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He looked at the industrial ovens, the rows of cooling sourdough, and the sign that read, "The Last Gram." He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement of his chin. I walked over and gave him a brief, firm hug. He smelled like flour and old tobacco. "You did the work, Grace," he muttered. "I followed the recipe, Reuben," I replied. He moved to a corner booth, tucked away near the back where the shadows were long. He sat down, his hands folded over the head of his cane. He didn't want the spotlight. He was the foundation. He was the only man in this town who had ever given me a tool instead of a shove. At 9:45 a.m., the perimeter was breached. I was in the kitchen, watching through the small rectangular window in the swinging door. The Graham family arrived in a swarm. They didn't walk in, they occupied the space. Pamela led the charge. She was wearing a strand of pearls that I knew were plastic, a floral dress that screamed small-town respectability, and a smile so wide it looked painful. Gerald followed behind her, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was 10 years too old and 2 sizes too small. Colton was at the back, his head down, thumbs flying across his phone screen. They looked like a picture-perfect family from a suburban brochure. The facade was nauseating. I watched as Pamela spotted a reporter from the County Gazette. She glided over, her voice rising to a pitch that carried through the door. "Oh, we are just so incredibly proud of our Grace. She has always had such a drive. Even as a little girl, she was always the one with the vision. We've supported her every step of the way, you know. Family is everything to us, Grams." I felt a cold, familiar burn in my throat. I remembered my promotion ceremony in Iraq. I had looked at the front row of folding chairs, the ones reserved for family. They were empty. The desert wind had been the only guest I had. Now, because there were cameras and free pastries and a successful business attached to my name, they were fighting for the best seats. They were scavengers, waiting to pick the meat off a kill they hadn't helped hunt. Colton looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the kitchen door. He didn't see me, but I saw him. He adjusted his collar, a smug, oily grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had me cornered. He thought his Facebook threat was a checkmate. He thought I was the same girl who had sat at the cracked table in 2003, waiting for a scrap of attention. I reached up and touched the breast pocket of my uniform. I could feel the sharp edge of the folded 2003 letter. It felt like a blade. It felt like justice. I wasn't afraid of Colton's photos. I wasn't afraid of Pamela's church circles. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was about to conduct a public autopsy of their lies. Grace, it's time, Dean said, peeking into the kitchen. He looked nervous, his apron spotless. Ready, I said. I stepped out of the kitchen. The room went silent. 80 people, neighbors, veterans, town officials, turned their heads. The air changed. My presence didn't invite casual conversation. I moved like a weapon. I didn't smile for the cameras. I didn't wave at the Grahams. I walked straight to the small wooden podium near the front window. Pamela was in the third row, leaning forward, her eyes bright with greed. She reached out and patted Gerald's hand, acting for the crowd. Gerald looked at his feet. Colton crossed his arms, leaning back, waiting for the moment to strike. I stepped onto the podium. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Lorraine sitting near the front, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed like a hawk. I saw the veterans I had served with, men and women who knew what the word loyalty actually meant. And I saw the Grahams, the parasites who thought they had invited themselves to a feast. I leaned into the microphone. A sharp, piercing screech of feedback ripped through the air. The high-pitched whine made the crowd wince, cutting through the humidity like a blade. I gripped the sides of the podium. My knuckles were white. Thank you all for coming, I said. My voice was low, carrying the weight of a command. Today is a significant day. It is the opening of a business, yes. But for me, it is the closing of a cycle. I paused. I let my gaze settle on Pamela. Her smile faltered just a fraction. There are some people here today who claim to be my family, I said. The words were sharp. They were execution style. I watched Gerald's head snap up. I saw Colton's smirk disappear. The room felt like it was holding its breath. They have spent the last week telling this town how proud they are. They have spent the last 23 years acting like I never existed. But today, before we cut the ribbon, I think it's time we talk about the reality of the Graham family tree. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the yellowed envelope. I have a letter here, I whispered into the mic. From 2003. And I think everyone should hear exactly how much an inconvenience I was. The air in the room died. I looked at Pamela. She turned the color of ash. Chapter 1, I said, my voice steady. The abandonment. The air in the bakery was stone cold. 80 people held their breath, their eyes darting between the woman in the crisp Class A uniform and the 3 people sitting in the third row. I could feel the weight of every metal on my chest. They felt like lead pressing against my ribs as I gripped the sides of the podium. The wood grain was rough, biting into my palms, reminding me I was grounded. I wasn't that shaking 8-year-old girl anymore. I was a captain in the United States Army, and this was my battlefield. I didn't need a weapon. I had the truth. I want to thank 2 people first, I said. My voice didn't echo. It hit the back wall like a hammer on an anvil. Reuben Marshall, Lorraine Collier. They are the reason this shop exists. They gave me a tool and a chance when I had nothing but a dented suitcase. They are my family. By choice, not by blood. I shifted my gaze. I locked onto Pamela. She was still wearing that fake church lady smile, leaning forward as if she were about to be called up for an award, her plastic pearls catching the light. Beside her, Gerald was fidgeting with his tie, his face the color of a bruised plum. Colton was staring at his boots, the smugness from his Facebook post starting to leak out of his pores. They looked like a picture of suburban respectability, a lie wrapped in a floral dress and a cheap suit. They thought they were here to collect. They thought they were here to own a piece of my success. But there are 3 other people here today, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. People who share my last name. People who spent the last hour telling the local paper how they supported me every step of the way. How they were always there. How family comes first. A low murmur rippled through the room. I let it hang there, heavy and suffocating. I didn't rush. I wanted them to feel the heat. In 2003, we lived in a house in the red clay hills of Georgia, I said. My parents decided they were done with the marriage. Gerald took Colton. Pamela took Jolene. They did the math on the back of a napkin. They realized 3 children were one too many for the new lives they wanted to lead. So, they drove me to St. Clair's. I was 8 years old. They left me on a concrete step with a blue suitcase and a greasy lie about coming back. I didn't lose my family in a tragedy. I was deleted to balance a budget. I was a line item that didn't add up. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was the kind of quiet you find in a graveyard right before a lightning strike. I saw a woman in the second row put her hand over her mouth. The local reporter's pen stopped moving. The community was seeing the Graham facade crack in real time. Gerald couldn't take the pressure. He shoved his chair back, a sharp, ear-splitting screech of metal against tile that made half the room wince. He stood up, his face a map of red clay and broken veins. He was shaking, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Grace, damn it, that's enough," he shouted. His voice was thin and desperate, cracking under the weight of 80 pairs of judging eyes. "You weren't there for the bills. You don't know the circumstances. We were drowning. We did what we had to do to survive. You're making us look like monsters in front of our neighbors." I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I just leaned into the microphone, my eyes cold and fixed on his forehead. I used my command voice, the one that stops soldiers in their tracks. "Sit down, Gerald," I said. It wasn't a request. It was a direct order. This is my line. This is my shop. And I'm the one holding the microphone. You had 23 years to speak. Now it's my turn. Sit down. Gerald looked around the room. He saw the veterans standing in the back, their faces set like granite. He saw Lorraine, her eyes narrowed like a hawk. He looked like a balloon that had just been pricked. He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping until he looked half his size. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform. The yellowed paper rustled, a dry, ancient sound that filled the room. I unfolded it slowly, letting the microphone pick up every crinkle, every piece of history. "I found this letter," I told the room. It's dated August 2003. Pamela wrote it to Gerald a week after they left me at the orphanage. She wasn't worried about my safety. She wasn't worried about my heart. She was worried about her reputation at the First Baptist. I looked directly at Pamela. Her plastic pearls were shaking against her throat. Her face had turned the color of a wet sidewalk. I read the words with cold, clinical precision. "Gerald, don't go back for her. Explaining a third child to the neighbors is just too much of an inconvenience. It's easier this way. Let the state handle her. We have our own lives to lead. She's better off forgotten." I let the word forgotten ring in the air. It was a jagged piece of glass. "You didn't throw me away because you were poor," I said, my voice a whisper that reached every corner. "You threw me away because I was a hassle. Because I didn't fit the image you wanted for your Sunday best life. You traded a daughter for convenience. And now, because that inconvenience has a uniform and a business, you've come back to claim a seat at the table you burned down." Colton stood up then. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at me. He just turned and headed for the door, his head down, the cowardice radiating off him like heat from a rusted engine. Pamela was next. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just grabbed her purse, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated shame. She shoved past a row of veterans, her heels clicking frantically against the floor. A hollow, desperate sound. Click, clack, click, clack. Gerald followed, head bowed like a dog that had been kicked one too many times. The heavy glass door opened and then slammed shut with a muffled thud. Through the front window, I watched them scramble into their rusted truck. The Ford cranked, spitting a cloud of black smoke into the Georgia morning, and then they were gone. The ambush was over. The target was neutralized. I stood on the podium, my hands still gripping the wood. The room was deathly quiet. I looked at the 80 people who had just watched a family get dismantled. I expected to feel the white-hot rage. I expected to feel the weight of the past. But all I felt was the air, clean, light. For the first time in 23 years, the scent of motor oil and fake pearls was gone. The humidity felt like it had finally broken. Lorraine Collier was the first one to move. She stood up. She didn't say a word. She just started to clap. A slow, steady rhythm. Then Reuben joined in, tapping his cane against the floor. One by one, the room rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't just for the bakery. It was for the truth. I took a deep breath, feeling the oxygen reach the bottom of my lungs. "Dean," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Open the cases. Let's serve the bread." I stepped down from the podium. I didn't look at the door. I didn't look at the road. I looked at the flower on Dean's apron and the light in Reuben's eyes. The war was over. And for the first time, I was home. The glass door stopped vibrating. The dust from Gerald's Ford settled on the hot asphalt. The shop went quiet. It was a heavy, hollow silence, the kind that follows a controlled demolition. I stood behind the podium, my fingers digging into the polished wood. I didn't look at the road. I looked at the flower on my sleeves. It was white and pure against the dark green of my Class A uniform. I was breathing, but the air felt thin, sharp. It didn't taste like motor oil or plastic pearls anymore. Lorraine Collier broke the silence. She stood up from the front row. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She began to clap. Not a fast, hollow applause, but a steady, heavy rhythm. Clap, clap, clap. Then, from the back corner, the heavy thud of an oak cane hit the tile floor. Reuben Marshall was standing. He wasn't smiling. He just looked at me with those ancient eyes and nodded once. One by one, the room rose. 80 people stood. The sound was a wave crashing against a stone wall. They weren't just applauding a bakery. They were acknowledging a survivor. I saw the local reporter lowering his camera, his face pale. He realized the scoop was bigger than a ribbon cutting. I saw neighbors who had listened to Pamela's church gossip for years. They looked at their feet. They had seen the raw wound. They had seen the hand that held the blade. I didn't bow. I just stood there until the sound died. "Dean," I said. My voice was a level line. "Open the cases. Serve the rosemary sourdough. On the house." I retreated to the kitchen. I needed the heat of the ovens. I needed the cold logic of the recipe. 2 days later, the real fallout hit. The news didn't stay local. The county paper ran a front-page story on the veteran-owned bakery. The headline was simple: "The Price of Convenience." It didn't name the Grahams, but everyone knew the players. In a town this size, a secret is just a lie waiting for a witness. Lorraine walked into my office without knocking. She threw a copy of the legal notices on my metal desk. Gerald's shop was gone. The bank had moved in at sunrise to change the locks. I could almost see the yellow tape across the greasy windows. I could almost hear the silence of the stagnant, rusted engines. Gerald had gambled everything on a son who didn't know how to work. The house had finally won. "Pamela got a visit from the church board," Lorraine said. She sat across from me, her eyes satisfied. "They don't like their charity coordinators caught in a $1,000 lie. She's out, stripped of her title. She's a pariah, Grace. No one will sit with her at the diner. Her reputation is dead." I looked at the notice. I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold, mechanical satisfaction. It was like watching a target disappear from a radar screen. The threat was neutralized. The perimeter was secure. "They did it to themselves, Lorraine," I said. "I just turned on the lights so the neighbors could see the rats." That evening, the digital assault began. My phone sat on the granite counter, vibrating like a trapped insect. I didn't pick it up. I watched the screen light up the dark room. Pamela. 3 text messages. I didn't need to open them. I could see the snippets. "Unnatural daughter. God will judge you. You ruined us." I didn't feel the sting. I didn't feel the guilt she had spent 18 years trying to plant. I highlighted the messages and hit delete. I didn't read the rest. In the army, you don't engage with a retreating enemy. You let them bleed out in the tall grass. Then, a final ping. It was Colton. "Grace." The bank took the truck. Mama is losing it. Gerald is at the bar and he isn't coming home. "I'm sorry. I should have looked for you at the orphanage. I was just a kid too. Please, I have no place to go. We're blood, Grace. Help me out." I looked at that message for a long time. I should have looked for you. A lie. He was 15 when I was 8. He knew exactly where I was. He just preferred the silence. He wasn't sorry for the abandonment. He was sorry for the consequences. He wasn't a brother. He was a sinking ship looking for a pier to crash into. I tapped the screen. My fingers were steady. I typed one word. Thanks. It was an execution. I was confirming I heard his plea, and I was confirming it meant nothing. I scrolled to his contact info. I hit the red button. Block this caller. I did the same for Pamela. I did the same for Gerald. I cleared the cache. I wiped the digital trail of the grams from my life. I was an orphan by choice now, a self-made ghost. I walked to the front of the shop. The moon was high over the Georgia pines, casting silver light over the empty tables. The smell of flour was everywhere. Clean. Mine. I walked to the industrial stove. The click of the igniter was sharp in the dark. Tick, tick, tick. Whoosh! The blue flame blossomed, a circle of heat that promised a long day of honest work. I didn't look at the phone. I didn't look at the road. The sun would be up in 4 hours. I had bread to bake. The war was over. The report was filed. And for the first time in 23 years, I was the only one who held the key to the gate. Sunday mornings in Georgia always start with a specific kind of quiet. It is a heavy, humid stillness that smells like damp pine needles and the first roasting batch of dark beans. I stood in the center of the kitchen at the last gram, watching the steam rise from my coffee mug. The shop was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt settled. The ovens were humming a low, steady bass note. The cooling racks were beginning to crackle as the crusts on the sourdough loaves tightened. It was the sound of a perimeter that was finally secure. At 10 a.m., the bell above the door gave a light, familiar chime. It wasn't a frantic rattle anymore. It was just a signal. Lorraine Collier walked in, her heels clicking softly on the tile. She headed for her usual back booth without saying a word. I already had her black coffee and a thick slice of toasted rye waiting on the counter. Dean was right behind her, snapping a fresh white apron over his head. Pop! Pop! The sound was crisp, like a well-executed drill. Then came Jolene. She slipped through the door quietly, her eyes scanning the room out of habit. She didn't look like the shaking girl who had stood on my back porch at midnight. She looked like someone who was starting to breathe again. She took a seat next to Lorraine. They didn't talk about the Ford truck or the red ink bank notices. We didn't discuss the empty house on the hill or the silence from the church auxiliary. We talked about the humidity. We talked about the batch of lemon tarts Dean had accidentally overbrowned. This was the family I had built from the scrap heap. There were no shared bloodlines here, no toxic debts to be paid, and no convenience to be managed. There was just the work and the respect that came with it. Every Thursday night, the ritual changed. I locked the front door at 6 p.m. sharp. I didn't turn off the lights. I waited. A white county van would pull into the lot, and 5 kids would tumble out. They were between the ages of 12 and 16. They had the look. It was a look I knew in my marrow. The wary eyes, the hunched shoulders, the way they checked the exits as soon as they walked in. They were the ones currently stuck in the foster care system, the ones the state called difficult cases. I didn't offer them cookies. I didn't tell them it was going to be okay. I didn't give them a single scrap of pity. Pity was a poison that kept you weak. I reached under the counter and pulled out 5 heavy canvas aprons. Tie them tight, I told them. My voice was flat, the same one I'd used to brief my platoon in the sandbox. The kitchen is a place for discipline. It does not matter what happened at your last placement. It does not matter what the paperwork says about your behavioral issues. In here, there is only the recipe. You follow the recipe, or you get out. I put a 20-pound mound of cold, shaggy dough on the granite table. I looked at a boy named Marcus. He was 14, with a scar on his chin and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Knead it, I ordered. Do not stop until your forearms burn, then keep going. Why? He muttered, looking at the door. Because the flour doesn't care, I said. I stepped into his space, not to intimidate, but to ground him. The flour doesn't care if you're an orphan. It doesn't care if your father is a drunk or if your mother didn't sign the papers. It only cares about the heat and the pressure. You master the dough, Marcus, and you've mastered something the world can't take back. Now, move. By 9 p.m., the kitchen was hot. The kids were sweating, their faces flushed from the ovens. They weren't looking at the exits anymore, they were looking at the bread. They were looking at something they had made with their own 2 hands. At the end of the month, I pulled 5 items from my office drawer. They were leather notebooks, the covers thick and smelling of oil. They were identical to the one Reuben Marshall had thrown at me when I was 9. I handed them out, one by one. "Write it down," I said, my voice low and sharp. "The weights, the cook times, the mistakes you made tonight. Write down the wins. Write down the burns." Marcus looked at the notebook, his fingers tracing the rough grain of the leather. "Why?" he asked again. "Because one day someone is going to try to tell you that you are an inconvenience," I replied. I felt the weight of the letter in my own memory, the one I had burned in the industrial furnace an hour after the opening. "They will try to tell you that you don't exist. You will need this. You will need the proof to look back and see exactly how far you walked out of the dark. This is your evidence. Keep it safe." I watched the van pull away into the Georgia night. I cleaned the counters. I folded the towels until the edges were perfectly square. I turned off the ovens. Ting! The final timer went off, signaling the end of the day. I walked to my car and started the engine. The Ford rumbled, a steady, healthy sound. I drove down Becker Road. I used to avoid this route. I used to take the long way to stay away from the shadows of St. Clair. Tonight, I didn't turn. I drove straight toward the silhouette of the old orphanage. It was a ruin now. The chain-link fence was sagging, overgrown with kudzu and rust. The windows were hollow eyes staring at the pines. It looked small. It looked powerless. I didn't tap the brakes. I didn't look at the gate where a blue Samsonite suitcase had once sat in the dirt. I didn't check the rearview mirror to see if the ghosts were following. I leaned into the accelerator. The headlights cut through the thick humidity, tearing through the darkness. I was moving at 60 miles per hour, and I wasn't looking back. I had spent 23 years trying to prove I wasn't an inconvenience. I had spent a decade in a uniform, fighting wars for a country that didn't know my name. And in the end, the answer wasn't in the medals or the apologies that never came. The answer was in the heat of the oven. The flour didn't care. And finally, neither did I. I drove into the night, the road opening up ahead of me, as straight and certain as a fresh page.